it's a beast. I mean, it's huge. And the real problem is and we'll go through it, but there's 41 separate implementations. So there's the overriding document, and then every country is different. So if you actually have to deal with this from a legal standpoint, it's ridiculous. But it's export control. So as long as you don't have a bunch of offices and random, we're good. All right. So we'll get started here. Wassenaar Disected. We'll start with me, which is always annoying, but you have to go through it. Why does anybody listen to me? I was an attorney for, the last 8 years of my life. I fought big tobacco. That's what I did. I was an appellate attorney fighting the tobacco industry in Florida. I had a kid, which is why I stopped being an attorney. I got tired of being on the road for multiple weeks at trials and the 90-hour weeks. So I went back to being software, which is mostly in office, but now 80-hour weeks instead. Software-wise, I'm best known for writing the Azure BitTorrent client. So I do actually know how to code and hack. And mostly I'm just a father anymore. It's actually the first time I've been away from my son is to be at this talk. So it's a little awkward, but it was a good topic. So I talked to, you guys know Iron Geek, I take it. Talked to Adrian. He said Wassenaar would be a good topic, so I told him I'd come speak. And this is what we're going to cover, to your point. The history of Wassenaar, what it was, what was its actual intentions originally, why we got there, why we have this, what worthwhile goals it actually does serve. And then everything you wanted to know, probably not everything, but a good bit of everything you wanted to know about Wassenaar. We'll go through that and why we're actually here, why people are in this room and care about it. I mean, 2 years ago, no one would have had any concern at all or cared, unless you were in the encryption scene, and that kind of ended in the 90s. What happened recently, you all know. I mean, the end game on this is the BIS rolled back the rules, and we'll cover what the BIS is if you don't know all the acronyms. And what do we do? What's next? What do we need to do to keep on top of this? And as I said, if you've seen me speak before, feel free to ask as we go. I'll try to repeat your question so it gets on recorded for everybody else. And I will try to actually avoid legalese. There's some because I had to copy part of the Wassenaar text, but the rest of it I'll try to leave out. We may mention, we will actually mention mens rea, which is Latin for mental state. Just remember that. It's intent. Okay. So Wassenaar, it was back in the 30s and 40s. We had some big wars. You probably heard about them. No one was probably there at this point, but most of our families were impacted by it. And during that time, we invented some really interesting ways of killing each other. Some really nasty ones. And afterwards, when we were done killing everyone, we decided, hey, maybe we shouldn't just sell this to the highest bidder. Maybe we should have some controls on these. Which started off with an agreement or association known as COCOM. And COCOM was a response to Russia, and the Russian allies were essentially called COMCOM. So this was the U.S. and their allies' response. So you had it was the Coordinating Committee of Multilateral Export Controls. Basically, it was just munitions controls. We don't want to sell a bunch of guns to Russia or their allies, and we don't want our allies selling to them. So let's put some restrictions on it. And that's what we had. We had 17 members. The exact details don't matter. It was mostly the Allies versus the Axis. It was a weapon embargo, like I said, it was mostly Russia. And it existed until 1994. I mean, it was a long-running agreement, but it was getting dated. And we needed to control what was known as dual-use goods. So dual-use goods are, multi-purpose, and we'll talk about that. Anyone ever deal with GPSs a lot? Do you know what COCOM limits are? If you deal with any kind of ballistics or rockets, COCOM limits are, if you trigger, I think it's above 30,000 feet or 18,000 feet and 50 miles per hour, something like that. And it depends on the chip implementation, but if you hit that high, the accuracy goes out and the chip stops, so you don't make a ballistic missile. What? No, they drop out. So they actually have a lot of problem with weather balloons. For example, some of the chips are programmed if one condition is met, which is really funny. So you hit 18,000 feet with a weather balloon, your GPS just drops out, because, you're clearly doing something terrible. But that's what COCOM is probably the biggest impact that we deal with unless you manufacture arms. So Wassenaar is the replacement. Wassenaar replaced COCOM. It popped up in 1996, and it was covers pretty much everything, to be honest. I mean, it's a very broad agreement. There's hundreds of pages of definitions of what's covered. It covers traditional munitions, And it covers dual-use goods, as I mentioned. Dual-use goods are something like a helicopter. You could use it for protection services, or you could use it to blow up people. So it's dual use. Same with GPS chips. You could use them for good things or bad things. Supercomputers, anybody remember the whole SGI debacle in 1998? SGI was they sold a supercomputer to Russia, which they were using. It was capable of doing nuclear simulations, and then the U.S. freaked out about it. Bad news for SGI. Back in the COCOM days, Toshiba had a big faux pas. They sold some equipment they weren't supposed to, and we'll talk about it, but the own country handles the regulation over their own entities. So Toshiba is Japanese, obviously. They were under the Japanese controls, but the U.S. freaked out about it. So Congress tried to propose shutting down Toshiba. It was interesting fights there. I assume most of you remember the encryption wars. We're going to cover them a little briefly, but I assumed everybody would be familiar with that from the 90s, unless you're too young. If you're too young, good on you. You're probably a lot happier with the U.S. If you do remember it, it was just a ridiculous era of bureaucracy. So what happened? Wait, sorry. Does anybody remember these shirts? This shirt under the encryption wars under Wassenaar was a munition. That shirt was classified as a controlled munition because it contained the key length is too long for the IRSA encryption. And when they were locking down encryption, that if you showed that shirt to a foreign nation, you could be really, really punished. It's pretty awesome. So they did some cool stuff like that. Well, I'll show you my favorite thing that came out of that later on from the encryption wars, which will be useful for people with Wassenaar eventually. Anyway, December 2013. Every 2 years, the Wassenaar participants meet and they propose updates and modifications to the current rules. Well, in December 2013, getting a little ahead, but December 2013, the UK proposed some updates, and that's what caused the big mess we're in now. And it was this intrusion software definition. And we'll go through that in a second, but we're going to talk about Wassenaar right now. So there's 41 countries. I'm not going to go through them all, but you'll note there's some big ones missing that are quite prevalent in the InfoSec scene: China, India, and Israel. And as a net result, if we're self-policing and they're not policing, there's a trade advantage there, obviously. If they can sell to anyone and we're locked down, it's not great for U.S. domestic business, which is actually why this started brewing up as a big issue. So we talked about this a little bit, but what's interesting about Wassenaar is it's an agreement. You got to keep that in mind. It is not a law. It is not a treaty. It is an agreement. It is self-policing. Each country implements their own versions of the regulations. So they propose the rules, and then the country says, okay, I'll take those and I adopt certain laws or trade regulations or whatever they need to internally. So there's 41 implementations of Wassenaar right now. Different versions. It's voluntary. So, some countries are a little more lax, some countries are a little less lax. And we'll talk about some of the problems with that, and which we've actually seen happen already with the intrusion software agreements. So as I said, every 2 years they come back, and then, it's self-policing. It's very important to keep in mind, and we'll talk about in regards to a recent scandal and why it's interesting. But Wassenaar in the U.S. is controlled by the BIS. Probably one of the most bureaucratic names for a department I've ever seen. The U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security. I don't know what the hell that means. I mean, honestly. Really, if you go through what they do, it's just a bunch of bureaucrats. I mean, they literally propose random regulations. They seem to put a lot of thought into it. I'm just not sure it's useful thought. It's very odd. The stuff they've proposed, especially in regards to this, is just ridiculous. But I think we're all pretty familiar with when the government tries to regulate stuff in the software industry, it usually turns into a hot mess. I've dealt with a lot of judges. Not many of them know much about computers. Some of the rulings are ridiculous. When they get it right, though, they do a good job. It's interesting. But the BIS apparently has no concept of software or what happens or the reality of it. And we'll go through why that causes a bunch of problems. This is really just all about a bunch of bureaucratic bullshit that was put out that everybody freaked out. And like I said, the UK proposed it. And the reason they did propose it was actually a worthwhile goal. It was, you all remember Finn Fisher? Anyone? No, yeah. Finn Fisher, it was a big hot mess. It wasn't the best day for the InfoSec world. Revelations, Finn Fisher was being used to crack down on dissidents. There was a big backlash. So in 2013, the UK said, hey, we want to stop this. Which is kind of funny coming from the UK, but still. Sure, it was, it was monitoring software, and they used, who was it? Was it Libya? I think that was the big issue was Libya. It was sold to repressive regimes that was using it to oppress on dissidents by monitoring and intruding their systems. The whole Arab Spring era. So Finn Fisher was sold out as a monitoring tool, intrusion software, to keep track of threats, and was really just being used to target people and, either quiet them in a number of not good ways. So we decided, wow, as a security scene, maybe we should be more controlled with this. And then later on, we, of course, got Hacking Team, which didn't help anything afterwards. It was very similar to what Hacking Team was doing. But it was a good goal. It really was. I mean, it's not a bad idea. Hey, should we be selling software that can be used by oppressive regimes to, kill people? It's a toss-up. Some people might say yes. Most people would probably say, no, I don't want my software used that way. So we proposed this as a munition, which is funny, but this is what got added, and I won't go through this, but if you read this definition, it roughly breaks down to, I don't even know. It's weird. So the goal here is, if you can see, they're essentially trying to prevent malware, rootkits, and the sub-clauses are very interesting. These are monitoring tools that have anti-surveillance countermeasures. They're supposed to exfiltrate data, or, the or is interesting, modify the code path. Well, anyone do Java development? If you do any bytecode manipulation, you are now intrusion software. If you have any kind of monitoring abilities, like, recording logs. So the net they threw was a little wide. Now, they tried to limit it. Wassenaar is a 2-tier definition, okay? This is actually what is restricted under it. And you don't need to read all this. The reality is that the net was just too damn big. It comes down to pretty much everything. What this roughly says is anything that could be or is used to handle intrusion software, which is roughly any piece of software anymore, is under export controls. Now, Wassenaar, they did try to limit it. They included a good number of exceptions. So, and we'll explain, or I'll explain, why the exceptions were good, but they didn't happen in the US. So, hypervisors, debuggers, or software engineering tools. Those aren't really defined. So, whatever. But the idea was to not prevent people from doing research, which is actually excluded. In the public domain doesn't actually mean the same legal definition of public domain. I should be clear about that. No software in the US is actually in the public domain. Just the way our copyright rules work, it's automatically copyrighted. You can issue a license to put it to available free use, but it's technically not in the public domain. So the definition of public domain under Wassenaar is really just open source or freely available. And it's funny, if you actually read the text of Wassenaar, it says, copyright restrictions do not restrict or do not impede what the public domain is, which is just funny, because it's exactly what copyright does, but they've just excluded it. Which, as you can clearly tell, this shit was written by attorneys, because if it doesn't make sense, an attorney wrote it. It's the only time you can literally put something in there that's like, nuclear munitions equals purple monkey dishwasher, and for the rest of the contract, it means purple monkey dishwasher. Despite you constantly say nuclear munitions over and over, and I don't know why attorneys haven't figured out how to write normally. As an appellate attorney, it used to drive me absolutely insane. I hated legalese. And Wassenaar could definitely use a rewrite. As you can see, there's this basic scientific research. It's a rather broad definition. It's essentially trying to allow malware analysis in companies to continue researching, or companies to do their own research internally. But it doesn't work. What they defined works out to, the net's too wide and the exception's too narrow. It ends up over-regulating by a good swath. And the patent application, I think, is super interesting, and I'll talk about that at the end of the talk. But that kind of exception always eats the rule. Always. Because we'll wait for that. But So not the end of the world. It's really wasn't terrible. It was a good first run. And these are guidelines, right? These are guidelines. So each country can go in and say, hey, you know, we're going to make this a little more broad. This is a starting point. But there were immediate problems. There were. I mean, as soon as this came out, several companies announced we're going to drop this division of our company. Vupin, if you know them, they shuttered parts of their business and restricted sales to only Wassenaar countries. There was a researcher in the UK recently, a younger guy who was releasing some analysis of Microsoft's latest security protections. He refused to release the actual exploits. He was advised not to because he could violate Wassenaar if the research was handed to non-Wassenaar countries, which obviously if you put it online, it's going to get somewhere. And then you mentioned this actually. HP pulled out Opone2Own, citing, not that they're shutting down half their business, of course. They cited Wassenaar, which is funny. They cited Wassenaar's Japanese implementations. Had nothing to do with the U.S. It was Japan's version, which Japan's version is very vague. And that's one of the big death knells of any law, and which is why it's unconstitutional in the U.S. to have a vague law, arbitrary and capricious enforcement, right? So in Japan, they had this vague law, and nobody had a clue. I mean, even the Japanese bureaucrats couldn't tell them what was covered and what wasn't. So you're not going to step into it and go fight with a country about export controls. And it gets real tricky when you've got foreign participants. Because now you got a foreign nation and you can't disclose things under Wassenaar and it gets bad. And this was an immediate impact. I mean, this is actually what's happening now. So most countries have implemented Wassenaar. The U.S. has just dragged its feet for 2 years. I'm not actually quite sure why on that. So it's funny. We'll talk about, We'll talk about why the U.S.'s job was so stupid. So you got to remember, there's Wassenaar itself, and then the U.S.'s version of it, right? And the U.S. version is why everyone in the U.S. freaked out. Wassenaar, nobody actually really cared about. There was a couple papers out, and people were like, "Oh, this seems odd," but nobody cared until there were proposed rules. And then when the rules dropped, it was May 2015. Everyone freaks out, and everyone freaked out because this is what the BIS dropped. And this is essentially the core of what they put out. The biggest thing you'll notice, and it's on the next slide here, and I'll leave this up for a sec. The biggest thing you'll notice is that they dropped all the exceptions. They dropped all the exclusions. They dropped the research. They dropped the public domain. They dropped the patent. They basically just said everything is under export control, which is bad. Very bad. So instant and nearly universal reaction to this, which I assume is how how did everyone in here get involved with Wassenaar or become aware of it? Twitter, people freaking out, or news posts? Yeah, I mean, it's funny, I was an appellate attorney doing personal injury suits, right, tobacco. I was getting calls about this, like, from companies like Sam's, who I happen to just be talking to, who were like, hey, you're an attorney and you know technology. What do you think about Wassenaar? And, you know, what do you say other than it's a fuck job? I mean, that's really, what's the best legal advice I can give you? Pray? Hire more of me. I don't know. It's hard to say. So they release this and everybody freaks out instantly. I would actually love for somebody to show me someone in praise of this. I couldn't find one. I went to the second page of Google, for God's sake, and I still couldn't find one. That's when you know shit's gone bad. Like, if I'm on page 2, it's not there. So, like I said, the proposals go further. They actually step over what Wassenaar requires. So, for some reason, the U.S. was like, hey, we're self-policing. Let's really police ourselves. Which, it doesn't make sense, right? We're protecting, you know, the goal, again, remember, is to protect dissidents and oppressive regimes. Okay, well, we've got export controls. Well, the BIS's rules essentially said, we want to take complete and utter control over almost every piece of security software. And it's not even just security at that point, due to the broad definition of intrusion software. Remember, it's pretty much anything except a hypervisor, debugger, etc. But oh wait, the BIS dropped those too. So it's just about anything. I mean, almost every software company would be under control. And worse yet is it started the research areas it was going to shut down because there's no research exception. Bug bounty programs went right out the window. Nearly impossible to administer at that point. And then you need an export control license for everything. So I should have clarified this earlier. Wassenaar, you can sell this stuff to countries outside Wassenaar. You need a license. Has anyone ever dealt with a government agency? So my wife's from London, and I did her immigration paperwork. The USCIS is a living nightmare. Fuck you. Hate them. Hate them to death. I wish they would be disbanded immediately. But having dealt with them, I never really was, I never dabbled too much with the government paperwork. It was the biggest cluster I've ever done with my life. I remember I had to get bumped up to a head supervisor at some point, which is a nightmare, at the USCIS. You got to call like the toll line. They're charging you $18 a minute. And you get on the phone, and I remember one of the problems was I paid a bunch of money to get the medical exam required for it for my wife. They failed to check off one box. Like there was a box for varicella, chicken pox, that they did not mark. And I remember I called them and said, hey, your doctor screwed up. It didn't mark this. What do I do? They're like, oh, you could just get another one done. And I said, that's great, but my wife's already in the U.S. and I have to get it done in London, but I can't take her back to London because her visa is one entry only. And they're like, yes, that's true. I said, so what do I do? I said, this was your problem. And I remember they said the rules were in conflict. One rule said I had to do one thing and the other rule said I had to do the other. And I explained it to them and they're like, that is a problem. And they're like, well, you could get it done locally in the U.S. and pay another stupid amount of money. Or you could file this waiver. And I said, well, what's the waiver involved? They're like, about 6 months of processing. And I remember just freaked out. So I submitted the paperwork without any changes and they passed it through anyway. The whole process, I swear, this bald spot is mostly from that. But what the whole point of that is that when you have to get these licenses, if you hired an immigration attorney, you can get through the USCIS relatively quickly. It's the honest truth. They know how to navigate the system. The exact same thing is true of almost every government agency. It's this red tape system, right? So if you've got the funds and the resources, you can get ahead in line, which is why a lot of smaller companies freaked out. But what's funny is the reason this all got rolled back is the bigger companies freaked out too. They're like, holy crap, this is going to shut down all our global operations. So everybody freaks out. Like I said, nearly universal. And my favorite part, the BIS, literally they got on a phone call. Everybody freaks out and starts saying, oh my God, this is terrible. The BIS is like, oh, we better do something, AKA large company called someone they lobbied. Lobbyists got on the BIS. BIS, oh God, I want to keep my red tape job. They have a phone call, and the phone call is hilarious. They actually are quite funny. They essentially backpedal and say, well, these are just proposed. We really just want your comments. So they drop a bunch of rules as a fishing expedition, apparently, to get everyone to freak out, to tell them why they're stupid, so how they can fix it. What do we pay them for? Just have us write it, at least. But on the phone, they were asked questions like, oh, does this shut down research? No. The follow-up was, but it would prevent the tools used in research. What? So you can research, but you can't send the tools to anybody. And since one of the biggest things was literally thousands of comments filed, which I think is hilarious because that never happens. I mean, it's very rare that everyone gets together and actually goes through the process of filing comments. So the big breakdown here, and I'm going to go through some examples of what some of the larger companies' objections and some of the smaller companies' objections, and even my company that I work at Catavolt. We don't do security software, but Wassenaar was so broad, it would have shut down a lot of what we do, which is weird. That's how broad the reach was. This is important, and I think this is where this all comes collapsing down. They're trying to regulate intent, and I mentioned mens rea, right? That was the legalese I was going to use. This really what they're trying to do is, on dual-use goods, they're trying to prevent the bad acts, the bad mental state. They don't mind if you sell monitoring software to a country that's not going to use it to kill dissidents. They don't mind that. But you never know what it's going to be used for, right? So the theory is that we have you fill out this paperwork, the BIS can review it. The BIS will then, oh, this is good, this isn't a bad intent, pass it through. Reality is if you have enough attorneys and enough paperwork, you'll get it passed through. Or if you have enough connections. So that gives an advantage to the larger corporations who've got the teams of attorneys. Smaller corporations are going to have a tougher time. And Hacking Team. So Italy is where Hacking Team was out of, right? They're a signatory. Their emails revealed that they were quite adept at getting export controls for their software. So even though they were selling it to oppressive regimes to kill people, they still got their licenses. Or when they couldn't get one, they just sold it anyway. So that's pretty awesome, right? Genius. Which is one of the problems with this. There's actually a section in Wassenaar that talks about we're only going to regulate things we can actually control. Software is really tough. Self-policing. So the question was, since this is an agreement and not a law, each country polices themselves, or if a country is offended by actions of someone else, they could try to sanction them inside their own territory, or own jurisdiction. No, this isn't, WIPO, there's no WTO on top of this. This is literally, each country has their own regulations. If you violate them, you're subject to your own. So obviously there's some interesting works there if you have enough connections in a country that system might be a little loosey-goosey, for lack of a better legal phrase. Well, deployment, it's export, right? So if you sold it, export typically involves a sale. So yeah, if you export it and install it, that's covered under the branches. So the U.S. government's supposed, the question is whether deploying Stuxnet in Iran by Israel. So Israel's not a signatory, so as long as they deployed it, it would have been fine. So that's cool. The U.S. selling it to Israel, they probably wouldn't need a license, except it's the U.S. government, so they're going to do whatever the hell they want anyway, let's be honest. Deemed exports. Exports within the U.S.? I guess I'm confused on that phrasing. So you have a foreign company. So you sell it to them. That's a tough one. If it could be, I would assume it breaks down to if the foreign corporation is actually held by a foreign owned, or if it's a separate subsidiary, it's a licensed independent U.S. corporation, it should be okay. But I don't know how much control you'd have to put into place to make sure it didn't get upstream, and who's responsible at that point. The honest truth is, at this point, under these rules, we have no idea what would be covered because the BIS has rolled it all back. So I want to be clear on that. We actually don't know anything right now, other than what they proposed, which they said they're not going to use. Maybe. Yeah, God help you. God help you. It's services would be covered. I mean, any assistance on intrusion. So my guess is if you're flying, the question was if you're traveling to a foreign country, are you subject? The trick is that you're most likely bringing tools with you that would be under violation of Wassenaar at this point. So yes, when you went to a foreign country not covered by Wassenaar as a signatory, and you installed those tools, you brought those tools and gave access to a foreign country, so you're boned. Does that count for me as a citizen of Wassenaar country? To a Wassenaar country? Well, no, for example, if I were to travel to a non-Wassenaar country. Brazil. And I downloaded Kali from a non-Wassenaar mirror. Oh, yeah, God help you. Yeah. Yeah, well, honestly, at this point, like I said, it's gray. We don't know what would actually be controlled, but most likely, yes, that would be a problem. Yeah, you don't play that game right now. My guess, my professional opinion is a lot of it's going to get rolled back because part of Wassenaar, like I said, is you can only control things. You should only apply Wassenaar to things that can be controlled, which is why there is a public domain open source exception. You're not going to stop the flow of a piece of open source software, right? But the US, the BIS, we dropped those rules. So if you would have gone and downloaded Metasploit, for example, you would have been fine under Wassenaar as proposed in 2013. You would not have been okay under the US's version of it, which is weird, right? Because you just downloaded something that they could go download themselves. What? I don't know. They're roughly parallel. I mean, the actual Wassenaar agreement, yeah, and the U.S.'s controls are pretty uniform. I mean, they do rely on a bunch of other definitions from other sections or other agreements. I mean, it's pretty standard of what the definitions of foreign national is, etc. There are special exceptions in Wassenaar for certain countries inside Wassenaar. So for the U.S., we favor the 5 participants: the UK, New Zealand, and I can't remember the other 3. But there are certain exceptions where we can give them extra things because they give the NSA data. That's really what I believe the exact phrasing is something along the lines of. God, I can't remember what it was. Something along the lines of like these countries are in parallel with the U.S.'s cyber. I don't know. It's basically a bunch of red tape speak for they give us data on their citizens. It's really what it is. It's weird. So we're gonna go up to here. This is what most everybody freaked out about. It literally placed the security industry and largely the software industry as a whole under BIS's control. So you took something that was relatively a free market and jumped it under a bunch of BIS goodness, which shut down security research largely. And as we know, security research and software in general moves a lot faster than traditional arms, which is why this breaks down pretty easily. This isn't, building a nuclear bomb. This is building software, which, has a smaller time scale than the amount of research. Plus, it's a lot harder to move a tank or a helicopter than it is to email someone something, which is why these controls are odd. Global teams is a huge issue with this. If you have a multinational corporation, if you have a team in Brazil, if you email them some piece of software that you're using to pen test your network that modifies control of execution and does monitoring, you have violated Wassenaar. Yes. To this? Well, yeah, exactly. The question was, how would this impact previous installations? You would be providing support, which would be under those legalese definitions. That would most likely be a violation to provide further support. Previous sales, obviously, it's not going to be retroactive. They can't punish you for something, or at least it would be a due process violation to punish you for something you did before it was illegal. The sale. Correct. Now I should say something like SourceFire Wassenaar, as long as it's publicly available and doesn't require updates, would not be regulated under Wassenaar, not the BIS's version. But there's essentially an open market. If you sell it off the shelf roughly and it can be installed without heavy maintenance, that's okay because it's available to all. It's roughly the public domain exception. But that's not the same for BIS. So larger corporations that are selling unmodified software, but if it has to be custom tailored and there's a lot of consulting required, you're going to get in that gray area and lawyer up is really all you can do at that point. Though I expect we'll see some big changes. I really do. The first rollout was just terrible. So the vague part, as I mentioned earlier, is probably the biggest death knell on this. The real problem wasn't that large corporations don't have enough lawyers to deal with the red tape. It's that they actually couldn't figure out what the hell the red tape was, which freaks them out. Freaks small companies out, freaks large companies out. Everybody threw a fit. So I'm just going to run through some quick examples of where this actually causes impact and go through specifically Google and Facebook's objections to this because they were probably the 2 biggest dissents on this. They got the most press. But my company, Catavolt, we do hire pen testers to test our system. They're not all from the U.S. And we have a team. We have a team that does development for us in Brazil. We couldn't send them. Even communicating with them about the research we had done on our systems would probably be a problem, which is weird. So I can't, right now I can pick up the phone and just call the guys and gals and say, hey, we noticed this problem, or, hey, there's a bug in this section. I couldn't inform them about a bug in their code. It would be a problem. Like I said, my software, we write a piece of software that you give it data and it'll build an app for you. Is really what it does. It generates the UI, etc. It's pretty cool. It does heterogeneous database joins, which is why I love the company, because I spent years as an intern at an insurance company trying to get Hibernate to do heterogeneous data joins, and it was a nightmare. So when I went to this company and they showed me that they were, joining SAP with MySQL, with, SQL, with Postgres in one call, I was like, wow, that's awesome. So it's pretty cool. And actually has a really good security model, I should say. But, yeah, just like I said, if I emailed the security alert, problem, because we have multiple teams. And I thought the most interesting one for our company was, we install, like we have a lot of clients in Brazil, for example. We install systems and then we'll harden them if we're asked to. We install a piece of software behind their firewall and, freaks some people out. So they want it hardened, whatever. So we'll go down there and harden it for them. That would probably be a problem at this point, which is weird because we do it all the time. We don't sell monitoring software. We don't sell, no one's gotten shot as far as I know over what we do. But our system gathers information and modifies execution. So we would be intrusion software and shut down because Brazil's not a participant. Why? Like, clearly not the goal. Like, well outside the range. Bug Crowd, which is Sam's group. If you don't know Bug Crowd, they do private public bug bounty programs. Really cool company, really interesting out of San Fran. They were actually some of the first people that pitched me on Wassenaar about, the issues with it, asking me questions. They have researchers all around the globe, and the U.S.'s implementation, the BIS's proposed rules on Wassenaar, would roughly have shut down their company if I understood it, or at least would have made it so difficult to implement, it would have been useless. I mean, they would have had to get export licenses for any companies outside the U.S. If there were any subsidiaries that were outside Wassenaar, you would have had a problem. Any researchers not from a Wassenaar group would be a problem. Downstream issues, bad. I mean, it would have had a major impact on their business. So as far as I know, it was a great success when the BIS said they'd pull it back. Did you guys have a big party? Because you didn't invite me, I'm just saying.
We were happy, I'm sure. There wasn't a big party. There's
still looming. There's a big fight. Sam was telling me an interesting story about they filed a comment and then a bunch of a lobbying group started calling them off the comments they filed to ask if they wanted to pay money to get it lobbied against. Maybe the first round was just a ploy from the lobbying group to get paid to lobby against itself. I don't know. It was interesting though. It wouldn't shock me. I'm a little cynical if you haven't noticed. Facebook. This is what they objected to. And the next slide is probably my most favorite thing about this whole thing. So I'm going to talk that up right now. But it was one of Google's comments, and it still makes me laugh to no end. So the no intra-global company was a big deal. Like I said, we already talked about that. The increased costs due to regulations, it probably would have skyrocketed the legal department's costs. Trying to figure out what needed a license and then actually applying for the licenses. And I don't know if the fee schedules were ever put out on what it would cost or how long it would take. So you got to think, if you found a 0-day and it was on a deployment in some foreign country that didn't have Wassenaar, you got to get a license, send it out, get approved. By the time that's all done, you've probably been pwned. I mean, that's just really how it is. They strongly objected to the fact that it limited information sharing. So like I said, I couldn't email my team in Brazil. They couldn't email their teams in non-Wassenaar countries. And they were worried about the whole bug bounty thing because they do private bug bounty programs. But Google, I'm going to start with the last one of Google's objections because I don't know why, it just makes me laugh to no end. One of their actual specific recommendations to the BIS was to add a flowchart. So they freak out about everything, and then at the end they're like, this is really vague, you need a flowchart. And it makes me laugh to no end because I know an attorney wrote that. There's some thought process there that it's all better if you just put a flowchart in it. I don't know why. These rules really suck, but I can make a bubble. I don't know what to say. Every time I see that, it just makes me laugh. That's actually in their comments. You should have a flowchart. Why don't you fix the fucking rules? Jesus Christ. No, these rules suck. Add a flowchart. I don't know. It blows my mind to no end. They objected to the vagueness, of course. They specifically stated that they would need tens of thousands of licenses, which I thought was interesting because it's actually probably true. I did like number 3. I liked it a lot. I thought they worded it the best out of all the comments. Under Wassenaar, reporting a bug to a manufacturer that was not a Wassenaar signatory would have been a problem. Which is really fucking dumb. It just is. it's so asinine and backwards for anybody in the InfoSec community to think that responsible disclosure is now most likely a felony under whatever the rules would have been proposed. I mean, you already are like on gray zone when you report one. Like you're worried if the company's going to sue you anyway, or try to break you down enough. You don't need an extra U.S. felony looming in on top. Has anyone read the book 3 Felonies a Day? Like everyone in the U.S. roughly commits 3 felonies a day. We probably in large commit more. If Wassenaar had come through, we would be like off the charts. Like we would just be done. They had the intra business and as I said, the flow chart. If anybody's got any comments on the flow chart, I'd love to know why that's better. It's just loop. Like God help you. I don't know. Like, it should just say software. Yes, license. Like I don't know. It was bad. So what happened? Complete and utter explosion. And it was rather quick. Credit where credit's due. I am a cynical man in general, especially when it comes to government red tape. But the BIS, they did relent, and they did it relatively quickly. We don't have anything specific from them, but they did come out and publicly say, we're working on new rules, and you can believe that to mean we will retract the current ones. It's not done yet. So we've got a nice statement, but we don't have any action yet. So the current rules still stand as proposed. They're not enacted. And what's interesting is we'll probably get new rules soonish. It's a toss-up for me. November, the BIS has their big conference. They may come out then, which would be interesting. But I'm probably leaning more towards they'll hold off till after December 2015, because that's the next meeting of the Wassenaar participants, which they'll most likely make some changes to Wassenaar. And if the BIS was efficient, they just wait till those changes came in. They may not. They may propose some really stupid rules in November and then get it all changed December. More work. I don't know. Overtime. I don't know. But there's definitely been some scuttlebutt that there's going to be some changes in Wassenaar. So hopefully we'll see them in general. And then where we go from here is pretty easy. I mean, reality is you got to stay vigilant on this. New rules are going to come out. They're going to have problems. I guarantee you. This is an extremely complex area to try to regulate. You're regulating intent with export controls over software. Software is such an ephemeral device. It's like trying to put Jell-O in it's just going to go somewhere. Like, there's too many things that overlap in software, and there's too many, it's dual use goods. Like, by definition, these have good and bad applications. So you're trying to regulate the bad, but you're covering both. And dude, I mean, just software in general, you got to remember, it's very quick moving. It's very easy to transport. And we go everywhere. I mean, we do. Like, I've worked in probably every industry I can think of because I was a software engineer. Insurance, healthcare, law, God help me, I can't even think of it all. I mean, and we probably all have. Most everybody here has or touched something. So we're going to have a very tough time with this. But very briefly, some of the possibilities for the rules that may come out, some potential defenses for it. I just want to go through that. So the open source tools, if they put this back together, if the BIS actually adopts the exceptions from Wassenaar, open source would be okay. Which, for a large part, that fixes a lot of the issues. A lot of the tools we use are open. They're not proprietary. I really like the patent exception because all you've got to do, roughly, it says that the minimum required for a patent application, but there's some wiggle room there that if your patent attorney happens to tell you, wow, you need to include everything in that. Patents are public record. Now the source is there. If you don't want to open source it, it's still it's open, but you still own the copyright. You could do it with licensing otherwise. The debugger hypervisor tool, another one of those exceptions that can eat the rule. It's a bugger. What's your tool? It's a debugger. Don't worry. As long as it can debug, you're probably all right. You're cool. Because essentially what's every piece of malware and rootkit? They almost always use the debugger bits. That's usually how you're hooking in there. So you can probably get away with it. It is a debugger. It's just really, really nasty. There were some fights among Wassenaar commenters about whether a debugger needed a GUI to be a debugger. Whatever, just put a GUI on it. Don't turn it on.
What if the tool has a debugger built into it?
Exactly. You just
Is that technically a debugger, or is that considered software?
No one knows. I would claim it was a debugger if I was trying to export it. I mean, personally, like they got to come to fight with you at that point. Remember, if you're in court, you already lost, so that's just the reality of it all. I mean, it's true. It's true. And then you got the First Amendment, which is it's one of those long, drawn-out fights. It'll invariably come up. And this is actually probably my favorite thing in the whole talk. So the crypto wars we talked about at the beginning. Do you guys remember when they actually printed out PGP? 6,000 pages of books, and then they scanned it in Europe because the restrictions required electronic formats of the code, so it was physical. It was fine. Whatever. Just brilliant. Like Phil Zimmerman was hilarious. Like he's just a cool guy. So, like I said, stay alert. You know, keep your head up. We don't know what's going to happen. When I put this talk in, it was all a big mess, and then the BIS relented, so it kind of took the air out of it there. We already did our scream and yell enough to get it pulled back. It's quite impressive, actually. Like the whole community got together. I was impressed. If you got questions left, you're welcome to fling them at me. If you want to ask something else outside of this, if you want to know anything about tobacco, happy to help. Quit smoking. Thank you.